Hi guys, and welcome to another of our iPhone application developer series. In this particular tutorial, we're going to take a look at UI picker views or picker objects. And here I've got an example of an application, pretty simple, that we're going to build using these pickers. So as you can see, I've got the application running in the simulator, and it's got a couple rows within it. And if I were to switch to a particular character within this, what I have really is just a list of Star Wars characters, and what I'm trying to illustrate here are the actors who were playing these roles. So you see for Yoda, you've got a picture of Frank Oz. For Obi-Wan, you've got Alec Guinness. Darth Vader, that was David Prowse, and Darth Maul, that was Ray Park. So what we're trying to illustrate, of course, here is the fact that you can have a UI picker view, and when you select an item within the picker view, you can affect another item. So I've of course got a UI image view in the background, and so what's happening is as I go to a particular row here, the image in the background is getting changed. So let's take a look at how we can create something as simple as this, because you can do a lot more with picker views, of course, but I think this is a nice, easy start to this particular type of object. Alright, so let's get started. To get started, I'm going to do a new project here. So let's go to xCode and go File, New Project, and it should bring this window up here. We're actually going to pick a single view application, so we'll select that, hit Next, and I'm going to give it a name. Let's just call it UIPickerView YouTube. Hit Next, and it's going to ask me where I'd like to save my file, and I am just going to go ahead and save it here. And there we go. So our project's now been created. So let's expand the project itself and see what kinds of files we've got within it. And of course, xCode's doing some work here in the background, so let me do that again. And you'll notice that there's a couple different files that we have to get started with. So there's actually nothing in the application, unlike some of the other templates that you get. So we have to add the picker view. So let's get started by going to our viewcontroller.nib file, or xib file. Click on that, and that should load up Interface Builder here. So before we actually start creating these applications, there is one small segue that we'll need to make, which is, one, I'd like to point out that there's actually two kinds of pickers. So let's start typing in UI, or just typing in picker into our objects library search here, and you'll notice that two of these come up. So one's a date picker, and the second one's a picker view. We're actually going to be working with the second one, but just to illustrate a concept, I'd like to pull the date picker onto our screen here. So let's pull it out. Right, so one of the reasons I wanted to start with this particular picker is because it has multiple columns, or rather, in picker terminology, it has multiple components. So every column that you see here is referred to as a component, and of course, as you can see, each component can have multiple rows. So that's some terminology you probably want to keep in the back of your head as you're working with pickers, because you'll notice that some of the methods ask about components, and it's important to know what they are. They're simply these columns. So now that we've talked about that real quick, I'm going to actually hit delete and get rid of that picker, because what we really want is the second picker, which is the UI picker view. So we're going to drop that onto our screen, and you'll notice that just like if you're working with table views, it has some default data just to show you how this might work. So what we actually have to do from here, of course, is connect our picker to an IB outlet that's going to be part of our files owner, and we also want to incorporate a UIImageView object on our screen, so when we select a particular row, it will actually update that particular image view. So let's do both of those things, and let me draw or drop a image view onto our screen. So here we go. I've just filtered for image. I get that, and I'm going to drop it onto the screen. I'm just going to drag that so its bounds rest just above this particular picker. There we go. So we've done our first step, which is we've dragged the two objects that we want onto the view, or onto the canvas, or whatever you want to call it. And from here we now have to create outlets for both of these items. So let's go about doing that. So if we're going to do the UIImageView first, there's actually a really easy way to do this, and I'm going to show you how to do that now. What you want to do is you want to go towards the top of your xCode window, and you'll notice that there's a couple different editors up top. So the one we want is called the assistant editor. So if I click that, what it does is kind of gives me a split view between sort of my interface builder area and the files owner's header file, which is viewcontroller.h in this case. What I can now do is I can just right click the image view itself. I can click on the new referencing outlet, and I can just draw or drag a connection here, and I have to do so between the @interface and the @end statements. And if I let it go, you'll notice that it's going to try and insert an outlet. So if I let it go, it asks me what I'd like to call this particular outlet, and let's say we'll call it character image, because I mean that's really what we're doing. So we're going to call it character image, and I'm going to set that to be, let's switch it to strong, and I'm going to say connect. And now what it's going to do is it's going to define an @property statement for me, and it's also going to simultaneously add the necessary @synthesize statement to the implementation file. So how easy is that? You don't have to actually go into the implementation and header files and create the @property and @synthesize and then come back and do the IB outlet connection. The other thing to point out is you'll notice that there is this little circle in the gutter. It's right by the line numbers, and you'll notice that it's really it's concentric circle. So you've got a circle with a dot inside it, and that implies that the connection has been set up between this image view and this particular property statement. So if I were to click it, you'll notice that character image is in fact tied to files owner. Great. Let's close that. So the next thing that we need to do with is with our data picker or our picker view, and what we have to do here, of course, is a couple more things. One, you'll notice that our picker has only one component. Remember, that's the same as a column, and we have to in essence implement something known as a PickerView data source and a PickerView delegate. Now when you define or nominate a particular class as being the data source and delegate, you have to implement certain methods that relate to that particular functionality. So the first thing we have to do is, of course, define the class that we want to be the data source and delegate for our picker. So let's go ahead and do that. And if you'll notice, if I simply right click on my UIPickerView object, I get this particular dialog window, and you'll notice that there's two outlets, one for data source and one for delegate. So what I have to do here is drag a connection to files owner and say that's going to be my data source. Same thing here, drag a connection to from the delegate property to files owner and say files owner, which is really view controller, is going to be my data source and delegate. Now I also want one more outlet here, and that's because I want to be able to really interact with this particular picker view. So let's go ahead and create it just like we did for our UIImageView. This time what I'm actually going to do is drag a connection here, and it's going to ask me if I want to insert an outlet. Yes, I do, and I am going to call this particular one we called our first one character image, so let's just call this one character picker. Seems to be pretty self-explanatory in terms of a name there. So let's hit connect, and it adds that particular statement, and we're good to go. So we can just now hit Command S, and I am going to switch back to my standard editor by just clicking that button. So there we go. So now we've got these two objects on our screen, and we've got them connected to our outlets in our files owner or view controller file. Now our next step is going to be actually to jump over to the viewcontroller.h file, and you'll remember that we said that we were going to have our view controller class act as the data source and delegate for the picker. So what we actually have to do is explicitly state that, and by doing that, to do that, what we have to do is come down to our viewcontroller.h file and add a particular line of code. So we start with our angle brackets and say UIPickerView, and you'll notice it's filling it in already for us, and it doesn't matter, we can pick delegate and then data source. I usually try to go data source, hit enter, and then I'm going to say UIPickerView Delegate. Great. So now we're explicitly promising to have view controller act as the PickerView's data source and delegate. And what does that actually mean? Well, it means that there are certain methods that you have to implement within your class to truly act as the data source and the delegate for a PickerView. So let's see what those methods are. Once again, to see some of the methods, all you have to do is click into that area, and you'll notice the quick help changes, and it gives me a data source protocol reference. I could also hover over it and click the option button, and you'll notice that turns it into a link. And if I were to click that, again, I get that same sort of quick help style thing, and I can take a look at the reference here. So let's just click on this right here. What it's going to do is, of course, load up the organizer. And if we were looking in the organizer, you'll notice that there are two tasks that we have to perform if a class is acting as the data source for a UIPickerView, and they're called number of components in PickerView and PickerView number of rows in component. So let's take a look at both of those methods. And you'll see that there's a small description of it, and it actually gives you the full method signature. So this is what we want first. So I'm going to hit Command C, and we're going to come back to our implementation file, and I'm going to come down here and create a new, let's just create a new area. So I'm going to use a pragma mark because I want an easy way to get back to these methods. So I'm just going to say pragma mark UIPickerView methods. And we've looked at pragma marks in another tutorial, but if you're wondering what those are, essentially if you want a quick way, you can use this particular breadcrumb or navigation here and easily get to your methods. So when I enter a pragma mark, it's actually just sort of a divider with this text, so I know that if I want to look at methods, it nicely organizes it for me under this particular heading. So that's what this particular pragma mark does. Right, so now let's do a Command V and paste in the method signature that we copied a second ago, and do a Command S. So what this is asking us is, how many components are there going to be in our PickerView, and it returns an NS integer object. Well, we know because this is a simplistic application, there's only one component, or rather only one column. So we can very easily just do return and say 1. Do Command S, and we are good to go here. Now, if you remember, there is one more method that we have to implement as part of the data source. But before I go back and copy that, I am going to take one quick segue and jump back into my header file. That's because I need some way of populating the actual PickerView. And to do that, I'm going to use a simple NS array. So what I'm going to do is create a property, say strong, non-atomic, and we're going to say NS array, and we're going to call that array, let's just call it characters. Command S, make sure we save that, come back into our implementation file and put in our synthesize statement for it. And we're going to say characters. If you remember, we've been using sort of this standard syntax where we do characters and then we set it to be underscore characters, and this is simply a way for us to indicate that this is a instance variable. Right, so we've got that in place. Now we're going to jump down to our viewDidLoad method, and I want to actually go ahead and set up this particular NS array object. So so let's load up our NS array object, and we're going to say something like, we're going to reference our characters instance variable, we're going to allocate some space for it, NS array alloc, and then we're going to initialize it with this method called initWithObjects, and you'll see that xCode prompts me pretty quickly with that particular method. And initWithObjects just takes, as the name implies, a set of objects, and they can be NSString objects, which is the easiest way to take a look at it. So let's say the different characters we had were Yoda, and then I think we had Obi-Wan, and then I believe we had Darth Maul, and then we had Darth Vader. So arrays end with nils. So let's just, oh, I'm sorry, this statement ends with a nil object, and we're just going to hit close that up, save that, and do a Command S to make sure everything is saved. Great. You'll notice that there is, of course, a warning that's appearing at the top of this view controller. So let me click on that and see what it says. So it's complaining that there's an incomplete implementation. Well, that's pretty easy. That's because we've defined view controller as being the data source and delegate for our picker view, but we actually haven't implemented all the necessary methods. So it's just complaining about that. We can simply ignore it for now. Right, so if you remember, we had, as part of our data source protocol, had two methods that we had to implement. We only implemented one of them. So let's go back to our organizer and take a look at the second method that we need to do. So the second method is PickerView : number of rows in component. So it wants to know how many rows are there in a particular component. So we can go ahead and copy this. Let's do Command C to copy. We're going to come back down here and do a Command V to paste it. And then let's fill in this particular method. So what this method obviously is asking for is how many rows do you have in your components, or how many rows do you have in the component that I'm looking at. So in this case, we know it's a simple application. Technically, we're only returning one component, or we only have one component, so I could return one here. I could also, in theory, just go return 4, and that would make sense because we have 4 objects that we're going to have, or I'm sorry, 4 characters that we're going to have in our picker view. While this works, this is less than ideal, because what happens if you were to essentially add more characters to your you're going to add more characters to your NS array, and then you'd have to go back and change this method each time. So what's better, of course, is for us to just return a count of the number of objects that are in our NS array. So let's just say our NS array was called characters, I believe, and we can just reference the count property and say characters.count, and there we go. Now what we're returning is, we're telling Objective-C, or the compiler, to say, take a look at the array itself, and the number of rows that we have in this component is really just the number of items we have in that particular array. So this will work out just fine. So you'll notice that, of course, the warnings all disappear. There is, in fact, one more method that we have to implement, and that is part of the delegate reference. So let's jump back to our viewcontroller.h file, and this time we're going to click on the delegate, and once again you'll see that there is a delegate protocol reference. We're going to click on that. You'll see that there are a couple tasks that we have to do. We don't really actually need these, but you'll notice that there's some text here that says the methods in this group are marked optional. However, to use a picker view, you must implement either this method or this method. So we're going to use the first one, and this is what actually writes in the name of the characters that we've got, the Star Wars characters we have, into the particular rows within the component in our picker view. So this is the method we want, so we're going to go ahead and copy it, Command C, and we can now jump back into our view controller implementation file, and we'll come back to the end here, do Command V and paste it. Right. So what do we need here? We need to be able to tell the compiler what to actually put in the rows of our picker view. So to do that, you'll notice, let's take a look at some of the parameters that are being passed in. So obviously it's expecting an NSString object, which is great because that's what our array is. It's also going to pass in a picker view object to us. It's going to pass in the row, which is the row it wants to work with, and then it's going to tell us which component it is. So this returning this is actually turns out to be pretty simple. We can just do a return, and then let's say we want to return the particular value that we're currently looking at within our array. So remember, our array is called characters, and then we're just going to access something called object.index. We want this method, And so we're saying basically we want to return whatever is at the current index within the array that we're looking at. So we're going to say characters object at index, and it's looking for a parameter there, which is an unsigned integer, and really we just want to pass it in this value, row. So we get the value of row within our method signature, and then we simply tell the compiler that we're going to return, or that it needs to look at whatever this row value is at within our array, and take the object there, the NSString object there. So if it's looking at 0, then it would be Yoda, 1, and so on and so forth. So that's all we really need to do as far as setting up our picker view. So we should be pretty well set here, and let's see here. So let's go ahead and run our application. And we'll pull up the simulator on screen. Right, and so you'll see that we've got our different characters are now appearing within our picker. So we've got that particular component well set up at this point. Right, so what we need to do next, of course, is remember we still have a UIImageView that we want to populate based on whatever the user is selecting from these rows. So how do we go about doing that? So let's take a look at what methods are available to us, and then we can essentially finish up this application. So let's I'm going to exit out of that and go back to xCode. So I'm going to jump back to my Delegate reference, and let's take a look and see what do we have here. So we see an area here called responding to row selection, and there's a method underneath it that's called PickerView did select row in component. So this is the method that we actually need to implement so that we can essentially change the image so that it reflects whatever row we've selected within our picker. So I'm going to go ahead and click on this particular method, and I want to grab the method signature. So let me go ahead and do that. Do a Command C, or just hit right click and hit copy, and we're going to jump back into our implementation file, and I am going to come back down here and do a Command V and paste it. Right, so do a Command S. So what this particular method will do, of course, is we want to act upon an event that's occurred, which is what happens when a user scrolls to a particular row within the UIPickerView. So once let's also take a look at the parameters that are being passed in. This is of course a void method, so it doesn't return anything. It's going to pass in the picker view that we're working with. It's going to pass in the row that the user has scrolled to or selected, and it's going to tell us which component it is. Right. So what we can actually leverage within this, because we only have one picker view and really one component within that picker view, these two parameters are sort of not really a big deal for us. What is interesting, of course, is the fact that we get the row, and that's great because we can leverage that and essentially affect a change within that UIImageView. Now, before we do anything in terms of changing the image, we actually have to import the image. So I'm going to go down to my supporting files folder, right click it, and I'm going to say add files to UIPickerView YouTube. And now I have a folder on my desktop, and let's see here, where I've saved some of these images of the actors that played in the Star Wars movies. So I'm just going to go into my folder, hit Command A, and add them all into my particular folder. You of course also want to make sure that this particular item, which is copy items into destination groups folder, is checked so that it'll copy it into the actual project. So we're going to hit add, and here come all my files right here. That's great. So to work with these files, what we actually have to do is if you remember, we've got a UI image within our nib file here, and what we want to do actually is we want to affect the image property of this UI image. And to affect the image property, we can set it to a UI image itself. So let's first of all go ahead and create a couple UI images. So let's say we'll say create our UI image objects, and we're going to create 4 UI image objects, essentially one for each of our characters. So let's say UI image, and we're going to call it Yoda image, and let's see here, we say UI image. Whoop, if I can type today. Sorry. There are days when I just can't seem to type anything correctly. Alright, so UI image, and then there's a method called image named, which takes a string object. And so we're going to use that method and just say at, and we have to give it the full file name of the file that we imported. So Yoda was actually played by a gentleman called Frank Oz. He was a puppeteer, and so the image we want to use here is oz.jpg, and that's the name of the file that we imported just a second ago. Next, we're going to do one more, a couple more here. So we're going to say UI image, and we're going to say Obi-Wan image, which was played by Alec Guinness. So again, UI image, image named, and I think I named this Guinness.jpg, Command S, and maybe we'll just quickly do a Command C, Command V, and change this to, I believe the next was mall, so this was played by Ray Park. Let's say park.jpg, and last but not least, Vader image, and this was played by David Prowse, so that'll be Prowse.jpg. Great, so now we've got our UI image objects. xCode is of course throwing a bunch of warnings because it's essentially saying that we haven't used these images or used these variables yet. Great, so now that we've got these set up, what we want to do is leverage the fact that this method gives us the current row or gives us the row that the user selected, and essentially what we'll want to do here is use a switch statement, and we'll use the switch statement to determine sort of what gets loaded into the UI image view. So we're going to switch on row. Case is of course going to be case 0 is going to be our first case, and we're now going to set our UI image view, which if you remember we created a outlet to it called character image. We're going to come down here and say character image. We're going to access its image property, and we're just going to set it to Yoda image. Great. We're going to do the same thing for a couple other cases. Just do a Command C, come down here, do a Command V. Actually, doesn't look like it copied it that time, so do Command C. Let's try this again. Command V. This is going to be case 1. This time we're going to set it to Obi-Wan image. Let's do the others real quick as well. Case 2. This is going to be mall image. And last but not least, case 3. This is going to be Vader image. And since we've got a default statement, let's just go ahead and make this last default be Vader image. Great. So now that we've got this particular method set up, let's run our program again, and it looks like I actually had it running in the simulator in the background, no problem. I'm going to hit run, it'll build and run the project again, and let's see what we get this time. This looks like it's taking it a few seconds, and here comes the simulator, and again we've got our picker view, but this time when I roll up I get the UI image views, image property gets changed, and the correct image is shown for each of these characters or each of these actors that played these characters. So there you go. That's our simple UI picker view. I hope this is helpful in sort of leveraging the idea that you can, respond to the rows that the user is selecting and really do some cool stuff with picker views. They are a very, very popular object, and you'll see them in a lot of different applications. So thanks for watching, and I hope this tutorial was helpful.